I am Manette Johnson, Clinical Associate Professor and Chair of the Training Institute here at Jane Addams College of Social Work. Welcome to this year's booster session. We are delighted that you chose to spend this snowy afternoon with us. The goal of today's session, Expanding Equity, Addressing Racism in Our Work, is to help you as practitioners deepen your knowledge regarding issues of equity and race. This session will enhance your skills, ensuring that all students, including those who are marginalized because of race, ethnicity, or disability, have the opportunity to grow, contribute, and develop. As school practitioners, we must be reflective, critically analyzing our values and practices in order to help our school community address inequities efficiently. So, in closing, this is a defining moment in our history, and it will take the collective efforts of all of us to assist students in achieving the academic success that they so deserve. Welcome again, and please enjoy the afternoon. And now, please meet our panelists.
Our panelists for today are Jenny Anderson, Don Deacon Moroger, and Joe Alger. Jenny Anderson is a licensed clinical social worker whose background includes work with diverse youth and adults. She currently serves as the chairperson for the Social and Economic Justice and Peace Committee for the National Association of Social Workers and sits on the National Association of Social Workers Committee for LGBTQ issues. Don Deacon Moroger has been a school psychologist for 20 plus years and is currently a special education department chair. She has dedicated her professional career to empowering and advocating for all students with a focus on people of color and LGBTQ students. Joe Alger is a licensed clinical social worker with a focus on adolescents and their families. He's worked to address issues of equity in multiple school districts, helping to start chapters of the Student African American Brotherhood and Black unions in different schools. Today, this terrific trio from Grays Lake North High School, District 127, will present Expanding Equity, Addressing Racism in Our Work.
Thank you so much for that welcome. We really appreciate being here today and are looking forward to presenting and having a conversation with you all about your work. We'll just take 1 second and we'll get our presentation up. Thanks, Joe. Today we're going to be talking about advancing equity. We know that a lot of you are here because you are already doing equity work in your schools and in your practices. And we hope to be able to share some ideas that have worked for us on how to expand that in your work. These are some of our kiddos too that you just saw. Some of our goals for this session are to just help you foster some ideas for racial equity in your own practice. And we're going to talk about that at a micro, meso, and macro level for your work.
First, I have to unmute myself. So first, let's talk about, so there's no shame or guilt in this work. So when we talk about racism, there's like a feeling that comes up, right? And so we have to address that. So let's just address it right away. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Okay, so if you get that feelings that emerge, please be mindful of that and then just stay present. Verna Myers indicated that there's no shame in this work. There's no guilt in this work. We're all moving forward, right? We were all outside for the contamination. And so therefore, we're here to do the work. And we're doing the work. So when you get that feeling and you feel uncomfortable, just kind of be mindful of it, but just keep moving forward and be present.
So we certainly, in this presentation, have an agenda and a number of things that we'd like to touch on, but we also recognize that kind of you as our audience have kind of things in mind, and whether there are specific things you seek to learn or to take away from this presentation, we'd love to hear some of those things. You can put them in the chat between the three of us. We'll monitor the chat through the presentation, and we'll have some opportunities for kind of question and answer towards the end, but we'll also seek to kind of incorporate and address some of the comments that you leave in chat as we proceed.
So while you're thinking about what you'd like to gain from the presentation today, these are some of the things that we're going to cover. We have an expectation that you're at this presentation because you likely have some knowledge of racial equity, but we are going to define and explore some common terms so that we're all on the same page when we're moving forward with our conversation. We're going to talk about some tools and takeaways for anti-racist practice. So truly, what can you do in your micro level practice, meso level practice, and macro level practice when you leave this presentation? We're going to take some time for questions, and then we're going to go through some references and some sources that have been helpful to us in our work. These are our rules for equity, and this is how we orient our equity work. We always lead with race. The work is always personal, and equity is everything that we do.
And so the reason why we lead with race is because when we look at gender, sexuality, education, ability, age, there's always inequity based on race. So the work is always personal. When we look at race and we look at culture, a lot of our culture is based in whiteness, and the norm is that we apply every tool to help us towards everything based on what we know, which is steep in whiteness, right? And we cannot do that. If you think about it, if everything in your tool belt is a hammer, and that's what you're fixing everything with, it's very difficult, right? And so we have to make sure that we look at that and not apply everything that we learned in our culture, which is steeped in whiteness, and apply that to all different cultures. And so sometimes when we look at, when we hear from some people that are not of color, when we hear from some white people, when we do presentations, one of the questions they're asked us is, please just tell us what to do, right? Just tell us what to say, tell us what to do, because they don't want to say or do the wrong thing. And so we want to make sure that we talk about that and let you know that there isn't always the right thing to say or the right thing to do. We just want to make sure that we are doing the work and being mindful and thoughtful in the way we're doing it. And so we'll talk about some of those things today.
So kind of our third rule of equity work is that everything is equity. And really what we're talking about here is that we're going to try and view every aspect of our own practice through an equity lens. And we'll talk about kind of for ourselves, trying to give some personal examples as you heard, right? This is personal work to give us an idea of how we think about some of these things, again, to give some opportunity to hear from you of kind of how equity practice looks using that equity lens to examine these different levels.
And like I said, we're going to define some basic terms so that we're all on the same page, but also because a lot of times the terminology around racial equity in our practice can be misused. And so it can be helpful to have some context as it relates to us as social workers and school social workers.
Okay, so let's look at some terms. So anti-racist definition, prejudice plus power. That is the anti-racist definition of racism. So David Wellman definition of racism is a system of advantage based on race. Dr. Beverly Tatum talks about what racism looks like, and is radical prejudice combined with social power, access of social, cultural, and economic resources, and decision making. So there's different definition of racism. So implicit bias. When we look at implicit bias, so let's break down the two words. So implicit is thoughts and feelings of which we are unaware. So think about like when you were growing up, and you used to listen to the news, and you used to see different things that come on over the news where they would talk about somebody robbing someone, or there were a gang fight, or there were somebody getting arrested, or there was a shooting. Okay, so think about what color of the person that pops into your mind. I know it's uncomfortable, but stay with it, right? Think about the color of the person that pops into your mind. So bias is a preference for, an aversion to a person or group. Implicit bias is thoughts and attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. So implicit bias, we predominantly act without conscious thought. Implicit social cognition, without conscious awareness of our social control in relation to social psychological construct, attitude, or stereotype. Implicit bias often predicts how we will behave more accurately than our conscious values. So once again, I'm just going to throw out a little scenario. You're walking down the street, right? And so when you see, a person walking towards you, right? And so the person is two Black men of color. Your first reaction is to finish that thought. I'm going to let you guys finish that, right? And so it's kind of like it steeps in you. It's like we're all outside for the contamination, and everything that tells you that you always end up finishing that thought with a person of color. It's a person of color who is in the gangs. It's a person of color that's walking towards you, so you cross the street. It's a person of color that was in the shooting. It's a person of color. Your mind just always go to that because that's what you saw, that what you unconsciously was steeped in, and therefore that's what you go to automatically, even though you may believe that you are not prejudiced. Everybody is prejudiced. Let's put it all out in the room. And so we all kind of go back to that because that's what we were brought up hearing. That's what we were brought up seeing unconsciously. And so, when the saying is that don't watch what I say, watch what I do. So a person, usually you can tell who they are by their values, by unconsciously what they're doing. And so that implicit bias comes out in that way, and you can see what's going on there.
So what does this mean for our clients? We want to talk about how will this manifest for you in your work with your students and your clients. This is an example of what this will look like in your work with students at school. So this is a longitudinal study from the GAO analysis of the Department of Education. It's civil rights data collection, and you can find this online. And it's from 2013, so it's a few years old, 2013, 2014 school year. But it was a huge study. Hundreds of thousands of students and schools were looked at. So what you can see here is that when you're looking at the student population and you're looking at the percentage of students that are represented related in suspension related to race, sex, disability status, and school year, there's a gross overrepresentation of students of color. And like we said, for us, race first, because of that trickle-down effect that Dawn talked about. If you don't address racism in your practice and you go to do interventions, what will end up happening is your interventions will positively impact your white students, but not your students of color. So racism has to be a part of every intervention that you have. So when you're working in schools, what you'll find is there's a gross overrepresentation of your students of color who are receiving suspensions, who are receiving discipline. And I would encourage you, I know we have some students, but also some staff who work in schools, as you're getting ready to apply to school positions and going in for interviews, look up your school on the Illinois State Report Card. And through the Office of Civil Rights, which you can just Google the school, look up for both of those, and you can find out what discipline looks like in the schools where you are interested in working or currently working as it relates to a racial breakdown. And why is this important in your work as a social worker? How this informs your work as a social worker is that when you are working with a student of color, and let's say you're like me and you're a white social worker, you can imagine what that means for a student in your space with you, that there's already a level of trauma just because of your whiteness and what that has meant for a student in your school system who has been likely targeted through microaggressions as it relates to discipline. And so that is something that you can talk about in your space with your students and with the families that you work with, and be conscious of in your interactions that schools for students of color and our families of color often represent a place where it's not a safe space, and where there is an overrepresentation and a targeting of students of color and our families of color. And so knowing that can help inform your practice to be trauma informed, and also to talk about how you interact with your students and families of color.
So Jenny had mentioned microaggressions, and we wanted to give a definition, again, to kind of work from the same page. One important thing to understand and kind of acknowledge with microaggressions is that micro is not indicating or is not meant to imply that it's something small, but that it's something that's covert and kind of hidden, unless we're often looking for and aware of those kinds of slights. It's also to say that microaggressions can have a significant impact, especially when we're thinking about racial trauma over time, over longer periods, and that these microaggressions ultimately have some significant impacts on our students and on our school systems. We wanted to touch on, and we share here a number of examples to again kind of put us on the same page and have us thinking about some of the slights that we see and that kind of we're trying to be mindful of, I will say. And if kind of others have examples that they have seen, whether in their schools or in other places, again, I'd say feel free to put those into the chat.
Okay, so we're going to talk about racial trauma. So before we show this video is about the talk. And I'm sure that a lot of Black and Brown people that are on this video probably already know about the talk, because you have that talk in most Black and Brown families around the world. They always have the talk with their, they have the talk with their kids about whether it is who they are as a Black person or a brown person, or who they are as a Black boy or a Black girl. For me, since I have 3 boys, my talk, one of many talks, have been around them driving and being pulled over by a police officer and what they should do, right? Keep your hands on the wheel, don't make any sudden movements, ask permission to get out your ID. And if you're accused of something that you don't think you're accused of, please do not argue, just agree to every single thing, and your dad and I will come and get you out of jail later, right? Even if you did absolutely nothing wrong, please just say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and just move forward. And so that's a talk that came in our house very often because we have 3 big Black males, right? And so we always also had another talk is that as a Black person, you have to work twice as hard because your Blackness precedes you. It arrives in the room before you, and you're judged on who you are, how you look. And so because we are all outside in contamination and we all have that implicit bias, you judge a person and then you find out who they are, and it strips away all those biases and you find out about the person, right? And so in a lot of Black families, everybody has different talks about who they are. So we're just going to show you an example of some of the racial trauma that happens and some of the talk that happens in Black and brown families.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
Listen, it's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you. You hear me? There are some people who think you don't deserve the same privileges just because of what you look like. It's not fair. It's not.
Remember, you can do anything they can. Difference is you gotta work twice as hard and be twice as smart.
Come straight home after practice. You got your ID? Oh, guess I stopped you. How's your review?
We're good.
You good?
Yeah,
You see?
we're good.
Okay, good. Now, when you get pulled over,
I'm a good driver. Okay?
baby,
Don't worry.
this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
It's not fair. But you keep showing up.
You are not pretty for a Black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
As Dawn mentioned, and as the video mentioned, this is like the real life experience of our families of color, our staff of color, our students of color when they come into our building, when we see clients in other settings. And to give some context to this, you might be studying ACEs, or you might know about ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Effects Score. And this is a screener that's used to determine childhood trauma, and it can be used as a tool to help inform care for our clients and our students. The people who have created the ACE scale have left off any questions about whether or not a person has experienced racism, because the traumatic effects of racism are so great that they can't figure out a way to be able to quantify it. So just take that in for a second when you're thinking about your work with students and clients of color. We are often taught to be exceptionally empathetic to children's ACE scores or our clients' ACE scores. And when we talk about racial trauma, we're talking about a trauma that's so profound that people who quantify trauma can't figure out how to quantify it, and what that must be like for our clients and our colleagues and our students and our families. And you can imagine how this might show up, right? It might show up that our students come in to our classroom and appear to be disconnected from us. It might come up that it takes a significantly longer time to rapport build. We might see acting out behaviors, right? Or we might see defensive behaviors, and all of those things are a trauma response. And so our response to students can be rooted in empathy and we can change our language. Dawn is going to talk a little bit about deficit language, but really it's our role as clinicians to see behavior through this trauma lens. And that's a really important part of how we will interact with all of our clients and students. But if you think about this through a race first lens, then you can be really in tune to how racial trauma might show up for your students or your families. And I see Brandy and Nicole, and I can't see your last name, said that it's important to recognize that people of color and Black are not interchangeable. And that's a really excellent point. And thank you for bringing that up. There is a difference between anti-racism and talking about what that means for all people of color or BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, as it relates to our students. And within that work, we also have to talk about anti-Blackness and what that means, because racial trauma will show up really differently for the individuals with whom we work based on what their racial background is. So we can't assume that a client who is a Latinx client or a Latinx student will have the same kind of racial trauma and the same kind of racialized experience as a Black client. And also, there's a lot of research on this, and I encourage you to look into it. If you're looking at how colorism plays out, the darker a student's skin, the more likely it is that they will be negatively impacted by racial bias in their school. And so that's something to note too, that, the term POC, people of color, and Black, or BIPOC and Black are different for different reasons. And so you should be mindful of how you use those terms and what that means in your work with your clients.
And so Jenny was talking about some of that language that happens in the school. And so be mindful of it when the language comes up, like that student is lazy, right? Or maybe that student does not have a good family background. That student is not going to college because, college is not valued in that family. How do you know that? Just kind of in a negative way, because that student is a Black student. Maybe you don't, in a school setting, they don't refer that student, talk about college with that particular student. They talk more about trade schools, or nothing wrong with trade schools, but kind of thinking that that student is not college bound, or just kind of projecting that implicit bias or your bias on that particular student just because that student is a Black student. So you will find that when you're working, or when you're applying for jobs or start working in schools, be on the lookout for those little terms or little sayings that go along with students of color there, that they're saying those things, and try to dig more into why that is. Is it because a student is a student of color, or is it because a student really does not understand what's going on within the classroom? So you will find that that language kind of floats around sometimes within a school system.
And so we recognize we're here talking to an audience of current and future social workers, and kind of we're under the assumption that we agree on these definitions, we agree on the importance of addressing racism, and we have empathy for our clients. But in part of what this quote represents from Sonia Nieto is really just saying that there's more that we need to do to be able to address systemic racism, particularly kind of in our own work, in our schools. And ultimately, that's what we want to kind of work to address now. And we talked about kind of, we're going to review these micro, meso, and macro level opportunities that we all have to address some of these systems, and kind of looking critically at our own practice.
So we're going to give everybody a reflection break. and lead into just a little activity where we would like you to take a moment and think critically about your practice and some of the things that we've talked about and where you think there might be some room for you to grow, or some what some of your experiences have been and how there might be able to be a shift for you.
So in there, just kind of think about or jot down these different ideas and different things. And again, feel free to ask questions, as now we'll be looking at kind of maybe more specific things that might bring up certain questions for your own individual practice. And here we're really talking about, and we've said that this work is personal. The only way to do this work is our own kind of personal relationships, our personal experiences. And so here are a few questions that we all want to be thinking about and that speak to kind of how we can engage in some of the work, thinking about our clients, thinking about how we educate ourselves. You know, a good question to what Jenny was speaking about: where do we get stuck with clients of color? Maybe how do we work differently with clients of color, have different kind of levels of success with different types of clients from different backgrounds. Something that we definitely wanted to acknowledge and mention is the alternatives to calling the police, particularly in our roles as mandated reporters. Many of us, including kind of all of the panelists, we work in a school that has a school resource officer, and thinking about how that's integrated, and again, kind of what alternatives we might have. There are kind of a number of resources we might consider there if we were to have that conversation. Something we wanted to touch on and that we had some conversation about in developing this presentation was about how and when we connect our clients, particularly our students of color, to therapists of color. We know that sometimes that connection is helpful. Sometimes it's nice to not have to explain certain aspects. Or if that's a preference of our students, we want to be aware of that. And we also want to think about the referrals that we offer. We have kind of a list of agencies or individual therapists that we might share with families, thinking about having agencies and individual therapists that represent kind of a wide range of races and cultural backgrounds and ethnicities is important. And here, countertransference, I imagine, is something that has come up in a number of different classes, or that we should be thinking about how we process some of our relationships and giving ourselves and kind of our personal practice those opportunities for open reflection with colleagues that we trust and who ultimately will maybe highlight some of the things that are hard for us to talk about or to think about in our practice. And so as we are thinking through, oh, thank you to the chat, appreciate the help there. As we think about micro practice, I just want to say here we are talking about small. Micro means small in this case. So we're talking about kind of our own personal practice. As we think about micro practice, again, we have a range of things to think through. You know, here, we want to address our own bias. I think as we've heard, you know, was highlighted earlier, we all have our own bias, so we should expect to find bias within ourselves, and that's something that we want to grow our awareness on, and work to address and to understand through some of that reflection. Again, kind of reflective conversation with colleagues has certainly been something helpful for me. We can also think about addressing our own bias and the kind of bias in our practice by keeping data. So, and you see kind of a little later, keep your own data of who you work with, who's coming back for the second, third session, what are the families that you're most connected to, who are you working with best as colleagues, and some of those pieces are things that we might look at. I'll mention that something that we have tried to do at our school this year, and something that we're doing now, is a data team where, as part of our student services team, we're looking at and thinking about data and trying to focus on issues of racial equity to understand kind of points where we might intervene. And I think the approach that we've been trying to take has been one where it's slow to really understand both the data and what that means for our students. And a big piece of that, and kind of our next steps, are connecting with our students and families through different focus groups to really understand where those opportunities are. In our own practice, we want to think about the posters we have on the wall, the signs that we maintain, the pamphlets that we have available, and what we're handing out and providing to different people. We want kind of each of those things ideally to be representative of the students that we serve and the communities that we work in. A really important piece for this is humility. And I think for me, that this work is more about process than it is about a lot of other things. And it's something where, as long as we can maintain an openness, a curiosity to the work, to understanding our students, their families, and where we can be most helpful, and maintain that perspective of humility towards the different decisions that kind of ultimately we have the opportunity to make, or to help influence our students. It's can be pretty powerful to just maintain that open perspective. Here, ultimately, we have some opportunities to interrupt implicit bias. Number of these things are kind of research-based interventions that are helpful to address the kinds of bias that we all carry with us. One certainly is engaging in intergroup contact, and ultimately that is kind of personal experience, again, is going to be where we gain the most information, where our personal experiences really do help to inform our bias. And whether that's from the news, where Dawn was talking about kind of the evening news and how that might inform our bias, those personal connections and the people that we're close to, and the conversations that we're having with our neighbors, and all of those things really matter. I think we recognize also that we live in a more segregated world than we might like. And I think that the pandemic in some ways has kind of shrunk our circles and our networks. In some ways, there's greater opportunity to connect with people who are not as physically close to us. We kind of put on here, even visualize intergroup contact is something that can be helpful there. We'd find kind of ways to expose ourselves to, again, the kind of broadened perspectives and the different kind of people we would ultimately work to increase our contact with. And I guess a thing that goes along with this is recategorizing in group and thinking about ourselves and our community, to include a wider range of people. So it's not just a homogenous group that we would consider kind of in that ultimately tight or kind of personal circle. Next one, explicitly rejecting stereotypes is important. And this is one where I would say, ideally, right, in our own personal practice, when we hear some of these stereotypic associations, when we hear that bias and potentially deficit language come out, we want to say it out loud, and you want to say it out loud, ideally to those around us, to acknowledge that. But even if we're reading through something and kind of hit that, it can be helpful to say it out loud, even if it's just us, and just kind of a personal note. Mindfulness and maintaining that reflective stance, kind of going back to where we started in terms of shame and guilt. Maintaining a centered perspective is going to help us to kind of bring our best selves and our most centered selves to helping to do some of this personal work.
So changes for meso practice. So some of the things that we can do is, examine your practice. Look at the grassroots, students and family-led groups and interventions. At our school, I know you saw in the beginning the pictures of the students. We have the Black Student Union. We have some of our parents that join that union. We have parent groups. You can have organic to your school or community, steering committees, support groups for students of color, such as affinity groups. Of course, students club, staff, and student book clubs that we have for our students to read about different minority issues, or be able to have a conversation in a safe space to talk about issues that are concerning them amongst themselves, or even students and faculty that are supportive. And then doing a lot of presentation to staff that are open to that. I know in one of the chat talk about how to move forward in equity, and that is a way you get some of your staff members. If I don't answer all of the question, I think it's part of it, where you move forward in just getting some of those stakeholders that are in your school to be able to join with you to move forward in the conversation of equity. You won't be able to get the whole entire staff to have that conversation, but you'll be able to get those people that are like-minded to have those conversations and move forward in that way, and be able to do the work in that way, and be able to present to staff and gain more and more traction in that way. So that's how we did that at our school, and focus on students of color, and did start different groups for students so they're able to be comfortable and be in a safe space, so that they're able to talk about issues that are concerning them within school and within the community.
Some changes that you can make to macro level practice also include some of what you asked about, Alex, and that is, like Dawn mentioned, that really grassroots focus of how to move things forward. So for us, what that looked like is, along with our student steering committee and our Black Student Union, which had students and parents, we collaborated with other schools who also have Black student unions and our local community college to create a coalition about with all of our Black student unions together. And so what that looks like is, every month we get together, we work on some goals, some education, and it's student directed. And so that leads a lot of the work that we're doing as a larger community. That's looked like collaborating on events with our local museum and for Black History Month in our community. We've also been involved in local activism and community politics, including a student-led march this summer for Black Lives Matter after the death of George Floyd. And that was a really profound moment where the students led many of our staff members in a community-wide march. and collaborated with some of our local community politicians and our local village. And that's a way that students can, again, it was a grassroots way that students could get involved in local community activism. We also have had our students present at board meetings and at Board of Education committee meetings. And that's been really helpful in getting support for some of the things that our students want to do. We look for ways to involve the community in our work. So some of what that can look like is in our student groups, we make sure that if we are putting on like a food truck festival is one of the events that we're planning, and a drive-in movie night, those are some of the events that we're planning to celebrate Black excellence, that we're inviting community members who have Black-owned businesses or who are advocates for anti-racism in the community to be a part of those events with us. And then one thing that I think also touches on what you asked, Alex, is we are always looking as a group for where we can make changes to be more inclusive in policy and procedure. And a question that we often get asked, or something that I think can often be a stumbling block of people who want to do anti-racist work in their district, is what can I do if I don't have any buy-in from administration? And that can happen frequently. And what I would say is that when you work to develop a strong grassroots base and it's student-led and family-led, you will start to change some of the culture in your school. And once that culture starts to change in your school from that grassroots base, it's easier to get changes in policy or procedure. So the data team that Joe mentioned earlier, that is a part of our student services team, happened because a group of our students, current students and alumni who've been involved in our steering committee, wrote a letter with their list of expectations about how the school would move forward with anti-racism in the wake of that second pandemic of racial violence this summer. And so I would say don't underestimate the importance of building that grassroots momentum and how that will lead into changes in inclusion or policy and procedure. And I would also say don't wait for an administrator to lead this work, because one, there's often so much going on for an administrator that this can't be a priority on their plate in the way that you would like it to be as someone who is engaged in social justice, and in the way that your students and family and colleagues of color need it to be. But also, top-down changes in a building won't get the kind of buy-in from your community at large that you really want to see to make the changes that you need. I mean, in an ideal world, you have both. You have both administrators that are super on board and really working on anti-racism and making amazing changes, and that grassroots space. But don't let barriers to administrative buy-in stop you from doing this work in a grassroots way that's led by your students. That's how most of our work has happened. So we're just going to go over a few online resources for you all, and then we'll take a break for some questions if you have them. Racial Equity Tools is a nice resource that has a lot of comprehensive literature and tools for you to use as you're beginning your anti-racist journey, especially in schools. I think it's great for beginners, but there are things that are more in depth if you feel like you've already started to do some of your own anti-racist work. And then we referenced earlier Verna Meyer's TED Talk. Melanie Funches talks about implicit bias, and Daryl Dwing-Sue talks about microaggressions. You know, I failed to mention this earlier, but those definitions that we gave and the theories that we presented at the beginning of the presentation, those come from these authors and from many other researchers before us. The work that we're doing in our school is based off of all those theoretical approaches by people who have done this before us. And then, Dawn, do you want to talk a little bit about Kelsey Reed and deficit thinking?
So that's a great article that just give you some example of deficit thinking within a school setting. So it'll give you more example of that when you're in a school setting to kind of look out for. So that's a great read. So we kind of throw that in there. So if you guys would like to look at that, that would be great.
Andrew, I just saw your question in the chat, and I am reading through. Can you speak to how you enabled students to speak up, voice needs, come together about race so that actions could become student-led? Was that aspect staff-led, identifying students, or creating the club? So I can speak a little bit to that. When I started at Grays Lake North 4 years ago, I did form a steering committee of students that has grown into some of the other student-led actions that have happened fairly organically. So yes, creating the space for that club happened with me and Joe and Dawn. And we have another social worker, Amy Fitzgerald, who I think is also on this call, who helps us with Knights Way and BU. And BU is our Black Union. So we did literally just create space for that club. We asked staff members if there would be students who might be interested in that. And we asked specifically for students who are representative, who are not what most people would think of as the typical student leader, because we wanted students involved in the steering committee who represented our student body. And we know the students who are the student leader whose name gets filled in every time there's a student leader request asked. And we wanted to make sure that we were representing more students than that. And then from there, with just a handful of students that had been referred, students referred other students to be a part of that group. The group itself decided what its name was, which is Knights Way. The Knights are our mascot. They have determined what interventions they've participated in at school, and how they have determined how we have celebrated different history and heritage months. They have determined how we have addressed mental health at school from a lens that is racially equitable and LGBTQ inclusive. So it really just, the only thing that I would say we've done as a staff, other than reserve rooms and sometimes help with funding, is to give students a space. And then the students have really directed a lot of how that's looked. Dawn or Joe, do you want to add anything about that too? I think we've just about wrapped up. So if you have other questions, feel free to throw those in the chat as well.
So for a Black Student Union, it's similar to that. You know, we just created a space for our students to kind of just be authentically themselves. We give them a chance to create their own president and vice president, and their agenda for what they want to talk about and different things that they want to work on, and just help them to connect to different people, like the people in administration in the building that they want to make changes moving forward. And so we invite, not really invite, I shouldn't say invited. I think other people started inviting themselves to Black Student Union because they wanted to see what the kids were doing and wanted to see what they were all about, right? Because the kids were really making changes and really moving forward in such a rapid way in all the things that they wanted to change within the school. They wanted to talk to the HR and, you know, make sure that people of color were hired more in district. And so we got a chance so they can speak to the HR director. They wanted to collaborate with the college, local college. So they started, you know, just collaborating and talking about different things that they wanted to move forward with. And so a lot of teachers and administrators and different people start taking notice of that, because those students were really leading the way in this group by themselves. We basically are there to kind of help to facilitate what they need and help them to put a structure to it. But mostly they're kind of leading the way on how they want the group to look and be able to talk about social justice issues and racial issues in a safe space that they're able to kind of collaborate with each other about different things that they want to do.
The only thing I'd want to add to that is that another thing that we didn't intentionally set out to do was to necessarily have parents involved with some of this. So with our Black Union specifically, we had a few parents who were interested in showing up, and their kids had said, we have a Black Union meeting at 3:30. So not too long after some of the students helped to kind of put that together and we were meeting, we had a few parents that would join us on a pretty regular basis. And right, we kind of adjusted to that difference, and having parents there regularly in our meetings. And while one thing we pretty quickly asked was that if you're coming, bring snacks for the kids, and let's talk about different ways you can kind of contribute in these meetings. It really has been something where kind of those partnerships and being able to hear directly from families about what it is that their kids need, what it is that the school can be doing differently to kind of better serve this community. Those kind of direct conversations and again, relationships were really important to some of the work we did. I also think that, you know, and how do we give student voice? I think working with those students and being able to, again, have that personal contact with the student and then bring that personal conversation to potentially administration or others. It's a lot different to say students of color having these certain experiences in our school. It's another to walk in and you know, say Brian and George have told me these kind of heartfelt stories and they would like to share some of this with you. Obviously we're doing that kind of working with our students to see what they're ready for. And but I think those personal connections, the more personal we can make this work for some of the others that we're trying to get on board, sometimes that's kind of one of the more helpful things to move that forward.
Yeah, and any other questions before we wrap up? I know we just have a couple minutes. Thank you for the comments in the chat as well. We've been really lucky to work with excellent students, but I know that excellent students are in every school. So we know it can happen anywhere. Lindsay, that's a great question. And I actually would say very similarly. I know that it's different because we are working with really young adults at the high school level. In the elementary school level, I think that grassroots organizing like this looks like both providing spaces for students to talk about what their needs are and recognizing autonomy for young people, because I do think that ageism plays a big role in us not valuing the voices of children. But I also think that what it looks like at the grade school community and at the elementary level is more partnerships with families. And to Joe's point, I think that at our high school level, because we work with young adults, we did not set out to immediately include parents and guardians and family members. In the elementary school, if you set out in that way, with the idea that grassroots equity work will happen in collaboration with your parents and families, that is an easy way to do really similar work. And that can look like a steering committee of family members or involved community members, where you create space for those community members to talk about what their needs are in your school and what's been working and what hasn't, and share their stories. And then also to get some student buy-in, even from the littles, about what do they need and what is and is not working for them. Yes, I can explain what a steering committee. A steering committee is just a really fancy way for me to say that I got a bunch of kids together and I had them tell me what they would like to see done in the school. That is it. We called it a steering committee so the kids would feel like it was really important, and it is. But really, it's just a group of students who tell me ideas about what they'd like to see done, and then the four of us work in collaboration to see if we can make that happen.
And one of the amazing ways that Mrs. Anderson has addressed the students is that I'm always amazed by. And I think that's why the students have gotten a voice. Going back to that one question before, is that we say that she has said is that I work for you. So let's talk about what it is that you would like to see in your school, what it is that you would like to change. Let's talk about some things that are going on that you want to talk about. So it's not teacher led, it's not adult led, it's the student feel empowered that they're in charge. And so the students are from the beginning have a voice in what's going on, and they feel like they're the center of the whole thing.
I know we're about out of time. And Mary, I just want to say, I see your comment, and the answer is yes, engagement has been challenging in the pandemic. And also, yes, we have continued students leaving movements during the pandemic. We're trying to create space for students that if it feels like a nice break for them to continue in these groups that they've participated in, they're there. And also hold that for some of the students, which with how much trauma they're experiencing as a result of the pandemic and the racialized violence that's been highly publicized this year, that having one more meeting to be on Zoom for at the end of the day might not feel good for them. And so we are engaging in a variety of activities that can be done either remotely, or we did a drive-by spirit bag pickup at the beginning of the year. We've just been trying to creatively work with the students and also hold that there's less engagement, and that makes sense, and we'll still be here when the need arises and we're back in school again.
I just wanted to make sure there are no more questions before we wrapped up. Does anyone else have any more questions? I just want to provide that space for a few more seconds before we wrap up, just in case. All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Jenny, Don, Joe, and Joe for your insights on expanding equity and addressing racism in our work. And thanks to all of you, current and future school social workers, as well as school-based practitioners, for joining us today. Thank you all for a wonderful workshop today on expanding equity, and we will see you soon.